key questions. The first is, how will different countries lift the restrictions that they currently have in many cases on in-person learning in the classroom? And that obviously depends on the country, but it's not an easy thing to predict, because as we've seen all over the world, countries come out of restrictions and then have to put them back on again when the pandemic comes back. So that's one question. The second is, how have the attitudes of students, or rather, how have the formats that universities have used to teach changed over the period of the pandemic? And that too is not just necessarily a linear process. Most universities around the world had to move their operations off campus in a very short time. And obviously they've now been doing that in some cases for almost a year, and are changing the ways they do it. So that's second question. And the third question is, how have the attitudes of students evolved over that time? Results. So my conclusion of all that is that we can only really tell what students' attitudes to online teaching and learning will be after the pandemic, once we are out of the pandemic and universities offer different options to them, and we can see which options the students choose when faced with a choice. So I don't think the future is going to be very simple. It's probably simpler for Daffodil, where you already have a substantial online operation. But I think we should look in this seminar to some extent at the totality of universities across the world.
There has been more innovation at Harvard in the last year than there was in the last century. So the pandemic has forced much necessary change. I want to make 2 points about important shifts that all universities face, not only in Bangladesh, not only in the global South countries, but in everywhere. The first is that universities and faculty think that distance education, remote learning, is a second-class way of doing classroom learning. And they don't understand that if face-to-face learning is an orange, distance learning is an apple. It's not a small, not very sweet orange, it's an apple. And if you don't see it as different, then you're not taking advantage of what's possible. Yes, you don't have the same color as an orange, but you can make apple pies with apples and do all sorts of other interesting things with apples that you can't with oranges. So policies need to be based not on how do we take classroom learning online, but how do we reinvent learning so that it takes advantage of the strengths of the online medium, capturing a lot of data about each student for personalization, allowing students to learn at their own pace, and so on and so on. And then that leads to the second point I want to make, which is that the most important policies relate to not learning, not faculty learning, but faculty unlearning. All of us as adults struggle with unlearning when the world changes, because our identities are caught up in what was successful before. So you're a great lecturer, and in very large face-to-face classes, you can hold everybody's attention. That doesn't work across distance. I don't care how good you are, 45-minute lectures, not going to work. So it's unlearning that, and instead learning ways of, if you're going to lecture, chunks of 10 minutes, and then activities that allow peer interaction that will work across distance synchronously. So unlearning is hard because it's not just intellectual, it's emotional, it's social, it's giving up something that you care about in order to get something new that can be valuable for you. And policies need to stress unlearning as well as learning. I think those are the two areas in which most universities that I see now are falling short in terms of their policies and their practice.
Psychosocial support is any non-therapeutic intervention that helps a person to cope with stresses. So you don't need to be a psychologist to offer psychosocial support. And then there are two main types of support: preventative, where you're in early stages of something, and restorative, where something has gone wrong and you're trying to restore well-being. And I think with your introduction, Dr. Leza, about the pandemic having affected everyone, we're probably in a restorative focus rather than preventative, although we will also try to do preventative work to help people for the future. So the area I think that I would like to focus on is human capacity. And the reason I would say that is that students are humans, and they are people living in the world, and they are living, as you said, often locked in their homes, unable to do their usual activities. And so the human capacity refers to the physical and mental health, and specifically considers an individual's knowledge and capacity and strengths. This is where my research has been, looking at people's strengths rather than their weaknesses or the failures. What are they good at, and where are their strengths? So, for example, acknowledging people, their coping mechanisms, given the difficulties everybody is suffering, acknowledging that they have been coping, acknowledging their resilience, the fact that they turn up to study, the fact that they have commitment and determination and an ability to overcome hurdles and obstacles. And in terms of the main way that I would go about addressing this and suggest to colleagues to consider is really broadly a strengths-based approach. So we have had a historical development in Australia, and I don't know if it's the same in Bangladesh and other countries, but I'd like to hear from colleagues, where we used to do things to students. And then we moved to doing things for students, a little bit more empathic, a little bit more careful, doing things for students. And now we're trying really hard to do things with students. So we don't try and assume what students need. We try to work with students to identify what they need. And so working with students to identify their strengths and then helping them to use those strengths, such as coping, resilience, determination, etc., and bring those strengths to their learning.
I think we'd all agree that we've been through a forced change. It wasn't our choice to go through something like COVID. And from what they say is that, this will only be the start, probably, of a different way of working and living and behaving in the world that we live in. But that forced change has really altered the way we think about pedagogy and more contemporary models, I guess, of learning and teaching. If there was any sector that needed to be disrupted, it's highly likely that it's the higher education sector, because it's been largely insulated by traditions which have carried for many thousands of years. I think all of us would say that we were mostly, or maybe we weren't prepared, that there were technology challenges, and more than ever, the infrastructures that our organisations have in terms of the technologies that support what we aspire to provide in terms of a fantastic learning and teaching or research experience need to be considered more deeply, and that really sound infrastructure that's required for a viable and feasible organisation to be able to offer face-to-face or blended modalities or online modalities has become increasingly more important. I think staff capability came to the fore, and whilst yes, our universities went straight online, and we did it in a few weeks like many others did, it forced that change in that sort of how our staff think about online and distance learning and what that looks like and what it can be like. And we had some of the most creative expressions of learning and teaching than I've seen in a very long time. And in my university, we said that what we had hoped to achieve in 5 years, we achieved in 3 months, which was pretty spectacular. I think also it became really clear that the new workforces of the future, the kind of jobs of the future, are emerging in a different way, and the kind of capabilities that a contemporary curriculum needs for the kinds of programs that we offer, and the role that digital plays in that. I think overall our students found the experience, they were very grateful. It always wasn't perfect, we knew that, but they were grateful that we continued and they could continue to study. Their grades were very similar, and so we didn't see any change in the grades. especially when we moved away from formal assessment in terms of examinations.
The obvious advantages of online programs to the university include increased enrollment, extending university reach, increasing student technological skills, mitigating the projected shortfall in instructors, eliminating overcrowding of classrooms, reducing infrastructure cost, allowing students to work at their own pace and learning style, reducing faculty bias, and improving retention and graduation rates. All these are important, and we have to focus on all these policies.
In Bangladesh, our capital is very heavily populated. Our transport system is not good. We have been suffering from traffic jam every now and then. Even in a university like Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, attracting the best students of the country, we could not complete our courses in time. Sometimes 4-year course took as much as 7 years. Okay, we should have initiated online education long back. Then our students would not have suffered for such long a period. I remember one of my students who got 4 out of 4, perfect GPA holder. He applied for admission into MIT, and the MIT authority told, okay, I understand. We understand that you got 4 out of 4, but you have completed your 4-year course in 7 long years. How can you talk about excellence of education? You cannot say about it. And he could not get admitted there. So for Bangladesh, not only in pandemic time, we need it in post-pandemic time as well.
The rise of COVID-19 would leave a lasting impression on the future of our world by changing the way we learn. Education systems shut down for the first time in the history as the pandemic swept across the world, devastating our economy, health, education, employment. Actually, unemployment rates skyrocketed. Our medical healthcare providers were swamped with treating a new virus. And schools were forced to lock down for weeks and months. Apart from the infrastructure, remote learning or digital learning or e-learning becomes a new norm of education. But know that working with e-learning for years, I realized that it requires a higher level of independent learning, intrinsic motivation, and a support system for learning process. We don't need to start building the new brick and mortar campuses. In addition to that, what we have, we should be thinking about digital infrastructure.
Many of you know very well that the practices in the Western world is that what we do in Bangladesh is that after graduation of bachelor degree, we are giving the opportunity for teaching. This should not be. They should be given a training or pedagogical and technological training before going to the class. So we are doing that one, and we are working with A2I. I discussed with you as well that we will work together to formulate a strategy for the teachers so that they are capable of both pedagogical and technological thing before going to the class. This pandemic gave us a lot of lessons. We learned a lot, probably to take another 3 to 5 years to go up to this stage. But because of the pandemic, we prepared so well. Now we have to move on. We have to capitalize on that.